Fear no more, fear no more, fear no more. The words from Shakespeare gain relevance with the passing of each century. Last day, we had seen a woman walking down the busy streets to buy some flowers for her party. And last day, we had seen her feel startled by the noise of a car, thinking it's a gunshot. The fear, the trauma, the anxiety of the war, if it could affect a woman who didn't have to go to the forefront, how much it would have affected the ones who had to battle it all out with their bodies. So we have seen Clarissa Dalloway, and today we will have a glimpse into the life of Septimus Smith. So don't go anywhere, because we are going to look at the most important parts of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Let's begin from the point when that violent explosion took place outside the flower shop, which was actually from an exploding tire. The violent explosion which made Mrs. Dalloway jump and Miss Pym go to the window and apologize came from a motor car. So who was in this motor car? And she writes, passers-by, who of course stopped and stared, had just time to see a face of the very greatest importance. So somebody very important was sitting inside that car against the dove grey upholstery before a male hand drew the blind, and there was nothing to be seen except a square of a dove grey. That means the car in question, it had upholstery, which means luxurious seats and all, but the identity of the passenger was not revealed. Throughout this novel, we will see that secrecy plays a very vital role so far as the theme is concerned. Right when we are about to understand something, right when we are about to recognize someone, a kind of curtain is drawn, sometimes literally, like in this case, and sometimes metaphorically. So, neither the readers nor the characters are allowed to get a complete glimpse into another person's mind, another person's thought process. But at the same time, this novel is built on the idea of following thought processes of people. So the identity of the passenger remains a secret, but people make their guesses. And one of the passers-by, he says, his name is Edgar J. Watkis. Edgar J. Watkis, with his roll of lead piping around his arm, said audibly, humorously, of course, the Prime Minister's car. So that's how he pronounced it. And why is this detail given to us? This detail has nothing to do with the story. This detail is given to us because this sentence, when Edgar utters it, is heard by a character who is one of the principal characters of our story. And that is Septimus Warren Smith. Septimus Warren Smith, who found himself unable to pass, heard him. Unable to pass. That means something made Septimus freeze on the spot. Like there was the sound of the explosion, and we know how Mrs. Dalloway reacted to it. But this is how Septimus reacts to it. He was walking along and he freezes there. He cannot move along. Now we are giving a description of Septimus. Septimus Warren Smith, aged about 30, so very young boy there, pale faced, beak nosed, wearing brown shoes and shabby overcoat, with hazel eyes which had the look of apprehension in them. Apprehension is like when you are unsure of things, when you have a doubtful look and you want to understand what's happening around you. So he's apprehensive all the time. And because his eyes were apprehensive, those who looked at him, they also felt doubtful about him. Okay, he didn't have any kind of confidence in him. The world has raised its whip, where will it descend? So he was always lost in some kind of a thought that a disaster is about to happen. Like a Pandora's box is already open, and uh, like with the dominoes effect, all bad things will keep on happening till the final disaster. So this goes on in his mind. And then we are taken inside the mind of Septimus and we are looking at the world through his eyes. Okay. So this technique is, let me remind you, the third person but interiorized technique. So the focus is not so much on the external events, but how the people are looking at those events. So you'll often find, the same event being looked at by different characters. Sometimes Septimus is looking at a woman, and then that is described to us, and the next moment, the same woman is being looked at by someone else, which we see through the eyes of that someone else again. Septimus looked, boys on bicycles sprang off, traffic accumulated. So, because he was standing still, he couldn't move. Traffic accumulated there. The motor car stood with drawn blinds because whoever was the passenger was a very important person. So, because of that, they didn't want everybody to know who was inside. And upon them, a curious pattern like a tree. Now, it is a very common symptom of mental illness at times that you find pattern where there is none, and you don't see the pattern when there is one. So your mind plays tricks with you. This is the thing that is happening with Septimus. He understands his imagination is at work here, that on that curtain some tree like shape is forming, and then he was getting more and more horrified. And interestingly, he feels that he is responsible for the traffic jam. It is I who am blocking the way, he thought. Was he not being looked at and pointed at? And it happens that he always felt people were judging him, people were looking at him, the insecurity in him. Was it not weighted there, rooted to the pavement for a purpose? Now he started to feel that I am not able to move because I have something to do here. But he doesn't understand what he is supposed to do here. But he can't move. So, this is what shell shock looks like. He completely loses touch with his own consciousness, and he gets transported to this horrifying, terrifying, dark universe where he doesn't know why he's existing anymore. Let us go on, Septimus, said his wife, a little woman with large eyes in a sallow pointed face, an Italian girl. Now, why Virginia Woolf placed an Italian girl in this mix could have several explanations. The idea of an Italian girl navigating in a London street with her husband, who is clearly shell shocked and unable to process information properly. This gives a sense of alienation, that this woman, she is not only feeling alienated in this city because she is Italian, but also alienated because of her unique position within this marriage. We will see this woman, whose name is Lucretia, who is also called Rizia as a shortened form, is a constant support to Septimus. But we will also get to understand what happens inside her brain, inside her mind, because we have an omniscient narrator here, right, who can travel around through everybody's minds. Come on, said Lucrezia. But her husband, for they had been married 4 or 5 years now, jumped, started, and said, all right, angrily, as if she had interrupted him. Septimus was rooted in that spot, thinking that he is causing the traffic jam, trying hard to understand why he is standing there. Why can't he move? And then his wife is pestering him. His wife doesn't know what is going on in his mind, and he feels irritated. And the most common target, or rather, I would say, the most common receptacle of irritation, uh, especially in case of war veterans or people suffering from trauma, are the ones who are closest to them. So obviously, whatever he has to blurt out is addressed at his wife. People must notice. People must see. People, she thought. So now we are inside the head of Lucretia, and she is worried that we are being noticed because my husband is standing in the middle of the street and this is causing commotion. he should move. Looking at the crowd, staring at the motor car, the English people with their children and their horses and their clothes, which she admired in a way, but they were people now. Because Septimus had said, I will kill myself, an awful thing to say. So while she is looking at the people around her, she is also thinking about what Septimus thinks. And Septimus is suicidal, Septimus wants to kill himself. Suppose they had heard him? She looked at the crowd, so she was worried. And her concern for Septimus is hurting her as well. Because, on one hand, if Septimus's intentions, his anxieties were known to everybody, all would treat him as a patient who needs to be institutionalized. And Rizia wants her husband to stay with her because she knows that he needs her emotional support. So she's torn between these two things, and she's always worried that what if people find out the anxieties that are hurting him? Help, help. She wanted to cry out to butchers, boys, and women, help. Only last autumn, she and Septimus had stood on the embankment wrapped in the same cloak, and Septimus reading a paper instead of talking. She had snatched it from him and laughed in the old man's face who saw them. But failure one conceals. She must take him away into some park. So it's not like their marriage had always been like this. This gap in communication. There was a time when they could be together, be happy together. And she's thinking about those times. And nostalgia plays a very important part, very important theme in this novel. She tries to take his decisions for him, and she says, now we will cross, so that he is motivated to at least walk. She had a right to his arm, though it was without feeling. He would give her, who was so simple, so impulsive, only 24, without friends in England. So Septimus, when he looked at his wife, he saw a woman who was all alone, and he felt certain pity for her. So when the wife says, let's go, let's cross, he doesn't object in any way, and he follows her lead, who had left Italy for his sake a piece of bone. So this is how we're introduced to Septimus and his wife. And then we are taken back to Mrs. Dalloway, who is now thinking about the identity of the passenger inside that motor car. And she thinks it can be the queen or some king's men. And while this motor car went towards the Buckingham Palace, people were also crowding and flocking. So you can understand that royalty or monarchy, which uh, basically is a constitutional appendage in case of England, uh, was still holding a lot of charm, and the luxury of the monarchy was kind of a waste, even if you look at it from the economic point of view. So, all these issues are touched upon, but somehow we see that Virginia Woolf is not focusing on any of the issues over a long length of time. She is rather skipping from one thing to another, and that is the style of stream of consciousness. You don't think for a long time on one thing or of one thing, and you skip from one topic to another based on association. Then there is sound of this aeroplane. So you see all kinds of sounds are evoked. First the motor car and now the aeroplane. And what was the aeroplane doing? In the years immediately following the war, people felt scared when they heard the noise of airplanes. It's like an enduring trauma was happening. Not many years back, London was bombed by airplanes. But this airplane was not for any kind of war. This was actually used for advertising something. Like the airplane would come, and the smoke which came out of it, it created patterns so that a company's name would be written or a product's name would be written in the sky and people would look. And this is where we get to see the encroachment of the capitalist economy, the idea of consumerism, And at the same time, we understand that there is a direct link between the losing of human values and the rise of materialistic worldview, which is symbolized by the advertisement. Everyone looked up. But what letters? A, C, was it now? It's smoke. So it took some time before it got into the real shape that is intended. So people were guessing, looking at the airplane, the smoke coming out, and they were trying to understand which letters are formed. A, C, was it an E, then an L? Only for a moment did they lie still. Then they moved and melted and were rubbed out up in the sky, and the airplane shot further away and again in a fresh space of sky began writing a K, an E, a Y perhaps. So nothing is for certain here. There is absolute lack of certainty in Mrs. Dalloway, even with the letters that are supposed to be very clear because they are supposed to advertise a product. Somebody is guessing Glaxo, somebody is saying Cremo, so they're guessing the name of the product up there. And Mrs. Bowley, she thinks it's toffee. Anyway, but what word was it writing? And then suddenly we are taken back to Lucretia. Lucretia Warren Smith, sitting by her husband's side on a seat in Regent Park in the Broad Walk, looked up. So the same aeroplane, which was creating so much interest in and around Mrs. Dalloway, was seen by Lucretia too. So you see, these two sets of characters, they don't physically meet each other, but they encountered the same events. They had encountered the war, which we don't see in this novel, but they had encountered it in the past. Similarly, the things that are happening now, the airplane, for instance, is encountered by both. So it is like this airplane is connecting the experiences of both Mrs. Dalloway and Lucrezia and her husband. So what appears to be unrelated, unconnected, becomes connected. Look, look, Septimus, she cried. For Dr. Holmes had told her. Now, who is Dr. Holmes? Dr. Holmes is the physician who is treating Septimus for his condition. And Dr. Holmes, uh, he was not, of course, a trained psychologist. He prescribed very random common things, and he said that, told her to make her husband take an interest in things outside himself. Like he was thinking that there was nothing seriously wrong with Septimus, and if she can distract him, he will be fine. Now, when Septimus looked at the airplane, he looked at it and he thought, somebody is sending me a signal. It's like he's always under this neurotic spell where he believes, or rather, he has this paranoid feelings that he's being watched, he's being instructed, he's sent for a purpose, he's about to do something, and he's looking for a message. It's like he's a spy who's hiding, and then he doesn't know what he is because all these things are figments of his imagination. So he looks at the airplane and he actually tries to understand, and he understands in his own way, in his own twisted way, that there was some kind of a message coming up. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at the smoke words languishing and melting in the sky. So that airplane was giving out those letters, and he thought that those letters mean something for me. And bestowing upon him in their inexhaustible charity and laughing goodness one shape after another of unimaginable beauty, and signaling their intention to provide him for nothing, forever, for looking merely with beauty, more beauty. Tears ran down his cheeks. And then we have the result of that uh, advertising endeavor. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee. A nursemaid told Rizia. Together they began to spell Tof. They were looking at the airplane and saying like that. And then the nursemaid, that is a person sitting next to Rizia, she also spelled Kr. And when she was saying Kr, the letters, Septimus thought she is saying K, like Kayk, Arrr, as if that means something. So you see the confusion in which Septimus is, the sounds around him, the sights around him, everything is getting translated into something mysterious which he cannot understand. But he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes. He would see no more. So he knows that up to a point, he still has control over himself. He can stop himself from imagining, daydreaming like this. But they beckoned. So it's like the trees around him were calling him with their leaves. Leaves were alive. Trees were alive. Now, of course, trees are alive. We all know that. But here, alive doesn't mean the way we know it. Here, alive means conscious about Septimus, that they're actually calling him. And the leaves being connected by millions of fibers with his own body. It's like the trees are connected to him. It's a very twisted kind of pantheism, I would say. And I don't know if it's a parody of Wordsworth's pantheism where everything is connected to each other. But then, if it is a parody, if it is a satire on that, it is because this war had completely shattered anything that is remotely romantic in English imagination. So, pantheism, a part of romanticism, cannot be sustained. It twists itself in a very ridiculous manner when you transfer it from the romantic era to the modern era. The sparrows fluttering, rising, falling in jagged fountains were part of the pattern. The white and blue barred with black branches, sounds made harmonies with premeditation. The spaces between them were as significant as the sounds a child cried. Now, all these random sounds, he is connecting them all in his mind into patterns where there is none. Rightly far away, a horn sounded. All taken together meant the birth of a new religion. It's like anti-pantheism, perhaps. And he's completely lost in this jumbled thought when Rizia interrupts Septimus. And Rizia knows that people are noticing. He's behaving in a maybe he's making some involuntary movements. His eyes are kind of looking terrified, and Rizia feels uncomfortable that people might notice. And she thinks that she needs a break. She has to walk away a little, have some time by herself, and come back to face this again. And she goes to the fountain, which is there in the park. They are sitting in a park right now. For she could stand it no longer. Dr. Holmes might say there was nothing the matter. Now, Dr. Holmes was not taking this seriously at all, okay? Far rather would she that he were dead. She could not sit beside him when he stared so and did not see her. We know what is going on inside Septimus's mind. Rizia doesn't know everything. So she feels disturbed when he looks out of focus and thinking about things that she doesn't know about. So here, the gap in communication is very, very evident. And then he made everything very terrible. Sky and tree, children playing, dragging carts, blowing whistles, falling down, all were terrible. And he would not kill himself. And she could tell no more Septimus has been working too hard. That was all she could say to her own mother. Now, she was sick and tired of the same drudgery of trying to act normally with Septimus and Septimus not communicating with her, and the physicians whom they were consulting, they were also not taking things seriously. And then when she was walking away from Septimus and she turned and looked at him to see what's happening inside her mind now, nothing could make her happy without him. Nothing. So it's like Septimus was in a world which was so away from her, but at the same time, she couldn't think of a world without him. He was selfish, so men are. For he was not ill in the sense he was not a bad person. Dr. Holmes said there was nothing the matter with him, so he was not ill, he was not sick, he was not a bad person. So, anyway, he was okay. She spread her hand before her and she could look at her wedding ring. Look, her wedding ring slipped. She had grown so thin. It was she who suffered, but she had nobody to tell. So the trauma of the shell shocked veterans, the war veterans, are narrated in many stories, but very few of them speak about the trauma of the women in their lives. who received these men who are now broken completely from the war and try to build them back up again. Some stories are there, like H.G. Bates's The Ox. We see how being a war veteran has its associated glory, despite his associated PTSD. But the lives of the women are often left out of narrations. And this is what we find in Virginia Woolf. She gives us Septimus's trauma, and she also gives us Lucretia's trauma. Lucretia was a hat maker, and she's thinking about her hat making days. Now, while she is away, Septimus is all by himself, and look at what he is thinking. Men must not cut down trees. There is a God. Random thought. But these thoughts are arranged as if he is being like a prophet, like the archetype of the prophet, as if he is noting down the words of God, like the commandments from God. Okay. He noted such revelations on the backs of envelopes. He thought these messages are being sent by God to him because he is like the prophet who must pass on this information to humankind. And what are those things? Change the world. No one kills from hatred. Make it known. He wrote it down. He waited. He listened. So he has his world inside his mind, which is completely different from the world he fails to understand, the world which is the external reality. There was his hand. There, the dead. White things were assembling behind the railings opposite. And then there was the railing of that bar. He was looking at the hand, and then suddenly he started to imagine that shapes were forming out of that area. But he dared not look. Evans was behind the railings. Evans, a companion he lost in the battle. And right when he feels that Evans is there right behind that railing, the wife comes and sits beside him. What are you saying? Interrupted again. So, this is what happens in this novel, a chain of thought, and then there is a break, an abrupt break, a break in communication, a break in thought process. And he feels that she is intruding. She was always interrupting. Away from people. They must get away from people, he said, jumping up. Right over there, where there were chairs beneath a tree and a long slope of the park dipped like a length of a green stuff with a ceiling cloth of blue and pink smoke high above. There was a rampart of far irregular houses haze in smoke. The traffic hummed in a circle. So everything was like we have already seen described. There they sat down under a tree. Look, she implored him, pointing at a little troop of boys carrying cricket stumps. She thought that if she could distract him, things would be good. Look, she implored him, for Dr. Holmes had told her to make him notice real things. Go to a music hall, play cricket. That was the very game, Dr. Holmes said. A nice out of door game, the very game for her husband. Look, she repeated. But what was Septimus thinking? Look, the unseen bade him. So when he was looking, he thought that he was not just a common human being. He has a special purpose. The voice which now communicated with him, he was hearing the words that the wife was saying, look, but he thought that the voice was coming from a different channel. The voice which now communicated with him, who was the greatest of mankind. Septimus, lately taken from life to death, the Lord who had come to renew society, who lay like a coverlet, a snow blanket, smitten only by the sun. So he's like waiting because he needs to change the world eventually. He has some ulterior motive, some great purpose. Suffering forever, the scapegoat, the eternal sufferer. So he is almost transforming himself into a Jesus like archetype. And then in his intense imagination, maybe he's uttering a few words which Lucretia doesn't want him to do because then people will think he's mad. So she tries to stop him and she says again, look, she repeated, for he must not talk aloud to himself out of doors. Oh, look, she implored him. But what was there to look at? a few sheep, that was all. And then another event in the external reality happens. What event? A woman comes and asks them the direction to a certain place. And that event is described in such a way that the thought of Lucretia or the thought of Septimus, it blends with the event where the woman is asking them the direction. The way to Regent's Park Tube Station, could they tell her the way to Regent's Park Tube Station? Maisie Johnson wanted to know. Maisie Johnson is a completely random external character who will not have any significance at all in that way. But then our lives are not built with characters who are significant for us, right? Like the majority of our day is spent with those people, those moments, or those happenings which are least important when you take our lives as a whole. So that means if you write a novel which is realistic, you cannot exclude what is apparently insignificant. And Maisie Johnson wants to know the direction. And just imagine who she wants to know the direction from. From two people who have lost every sense of direction in life. But then Maisie Johnson was an outsider. She has come from Edinburgh. And it is now Maisie Johnson's point of view that we are looking at Septimus and Lysia. Both seemed queer, Maisie Johnson thought. Everything seemed very queer. In London for the first time, now we are taken inside the life of Maisie Johnson. How is she looking at them? In London for the first time, come to take up a post at her uncle's in Leadenhall Street, and now walking through Regent's Park in the morning. This couple on the chairs gave her quite a turn. The young woman seeming foreign, that is Lucretia, the man looking queer, so that should she be very old, she would still remember and make it jangle again among her memories how she had walked through Regent's Park on a fine summer's morning 50 years ago. So somehow these two men and women sitting there looked so very weird that she thought that if she was an old woman, she would still remember this day. And what would she remember when she would be 50 years older? For she was only 19 and had got her way at last to come to London. And now, how queer it was, this couple she had asked the way of. And the girl started and jerked her hand. And the man, he seemed awfully odd. So, this is Maisie Johnson, 50 years later, thinking about this day, thinking about two people, Septimus and Lucrezia, who are the central characters of, like, almost central characters of our story. So, why is this mentioned even? This is to make us understand that the whole idea of central character is a false idea. Because what is Septimus? He might be a central character in his own story, but in the story of Maisie Johnson, he's just one memory, random memory, weird memory, nothing more than that. So, how far are we as individuals significant even? We might think we constitute the most important part of the universe, like Septimus is at the moment thinking. But he is just one whip of memory in the minds of a third person. And then Maisie Johnson, who was thinking all this, was also not the most important character. She was the most important character in her life. Because when someone else looked at Maisie Johnson, then Maisie Johnson is also just a memory that is to be formed. And who was looking at Maisie Johnson? Mrs. Dempster. That girl, thought Mrs. Dempster. Like Mrs. Dempster was also in that park, who saved crusts for the squirrels and often ate her lunch in Regent's Park. That girl, Mrs. Dempster is thinking about Maisie Johnson. Don't know a thing yet. Maisie Johnson is 19 years old, young, and looking at her, Mrs. Dempster is feeling nostalgic. Why? Because she represents, that is, Maisie represents the youth which is full of possibilities. And she thinks And really, it seems to her better to be a little stout, a little slack, a little moderate in one's expectations. He will get married, and you're pretty enough, thought Mrs. Dempster. Get married, she thought. Then you will know. Oh, the cooks and so on. Every man has his ways. But whether I'd have chosen quite like that, if I could have known, thought Mrs. Dempster, and could not help wishing to whisper a word to Maisie Johnson. So it's like she might have her thoughts, but she's not telling her anything. Okay. It's like she's having these thoughts, looking at Maisie, and she's thinking about her life. That what have I not given to my family, to my own people? It has been a hard life for her. And then we come to the point where this section is concluded. It was strange, it was still, not a sound was to be heard above the traffic. Unguided, it seemed. So it's like the aeroplane had no direction to follow. So you see, everybody right now in this novel is looking for a direction in some way. The aeroplane doesn't need a direction. What is doing? Sped of its own free will, and now curving up and up, straight up, like something mounting in ecstasy, in pure delight, out from behind poured white smoke, looping, writing T and O and F. So it was actually writing toffee. Clarissa Dalloway returns home. What are they looking at? Said Clarissa Dalloway to the maid who opened her door. The whole of the house was cool as a vault, so the aeroplane was visible from even Clarissa's house. So when Clarissa reaches, that same aeroplane is connecting Clarissa and Septimus. Okay? And she doesn't know what people are looking at. Now her house is described. The hall of the house was cool as a vault. The word vault is not at all a welcoming word when you place it in context of somebody's home. Vault is a strong room where you store jewelry, maybe some important documents, something very cold and something that lacks the warmth of life. Usually, vaults are made of steel, okay? But this house is described as a house which is cool as a vault. So, lack of human warmth, perhaps. The word vault again represents security. So, you see how duality is found in the metaphor of the vault, or rather, the simile of the vault. Vault on one hand means security. So, this house of Clarissa is offering her a security from the outside reality. But at the same time, it is not offering her any warmth. Okay, so a double meaning is implied when this simile is used. And then this continues. She felt like a nun who has left the world and feels fold round her the familiar veils and the response to old devotions. But the idea of comparing her to a nun also runs the risk of making us understand or have a doubt whether she is happy in her marriage or not. But right then, Virginia Woolf stops our thought and tries to give us some idea of how she actually felt. Moments like this are buds on the tree of life, flowers of darkness they are, she thought, as if some lovely rose had blossomed for her eyes only. Not for a moment did she believe in God, but all the more, she thought, taking up the pad, must one repay in daily life to servants, yes, to dogs and canaries, above all to Richard, her husband, who was the foundation of it. So she feels that she doesn't have to be good because of any God. She has to give back as if she has taken some loan of happiness from all people around her and she has to pay them back. And above everybody else, she mentions her husband's name, Richard. One must pay back from this secret deposit of exquisite moments, she thought, lifting the pad while Lucy stood by her, trying to explain how. And then she reads something on the telephone pad. Lady Bruton wishes to know if Mr. Dalloway will lunch with her today. So she is getting this information that her husband is not going to have lunch with her, but with a person called Lady Bruton. And she's getting this information from a piece of writing and not from the husband. Mr. Dalloway, ma'am, told me to tell you he would be lunching out. So now she is given this information from the servant. Dear, said Clarissa. And Lucy shared, as she meant her, to her disappointment, but not the pang, felt the concord between them, took the hint, thought how the gentry love gilded her own future with calm. So it's like Mrs. Dalloway is like a role model for Lucy. She's always feeling honored to be with her. And suddenly, Clarissa utters these words from Shakespeare. Fear no more, said Clarissa. Fear no more the heat of the sun. For the shock of Lady Bruton asking Richard to lunch without her made the moment in which she had stood shiver. So she was standing in a moment. She was having her moment. And then she had this information. And that moment destabilizes because she can't process the idea that Bruton is asking her husband to go and have lunch with him alone. And then we have description of Millicent Bruton and her lunch parties. And we also understand that no matter how confident she might otherwise look, there is always a sense of insecurity in Mrs. Dalloway as to how far she is the right fit for Richard. She feels dejected. And what does she do? Like a nun withdrawing or a child exploring a tower, she went upstairs, paused at the window, came to the bathroom. There was the green linoleum and a tap dripping. Idea of tap dripping is an idea of a slow waste which people are too lazy to stop. But nonetheless, if the tap is dripping continuously, it can erode even stones. So, this idea of a tap dripping is very relevant when it comes to the idea of marriage as represented by Virginia Woolf often, is that you don't have to have a really abusive marriage or an abusive husband. Even a tap dripping condition where, small little things happening every day persistently for a long time will create the damage which can never be recovered. So that is the idea of tap tripping here. So does Virginia Woolf want us to feel that her life with Richard was also in a state of erosion because of a tap tripping somewhere? Like small insignificant things happening every day, one leading to another, none of which are significant in their own right, but as a cumulative effect, they can erode away even granite. There was an emptiness about the heart of life, an attic room. Women must put off their rich apparel. At midday, they must disrobe. Midday is like, symbolically again, the middle of one's life, the middle age of one's life. And it's a female midlife crisis we're looking at when the hormones don't help one cheer up anymore, and the body begins to show deterioration. And till that time, women engage in wearing rich apparel, as in some kind of role play to attract people, to pretend what they are not. But it's like when half of your life is over, when you should stop pretending what you are not. And that is what disrobing means. It's like putting away the veil so that the world can see who you are. Like she had enough of pretending, of role playing. She thinks I should stop now. It's the midday of my life. But then this idea of disrobing also has the feeling of shame and nakedness. And she later on feels like this. So the room was an attic, the bed narrow, and lying there reading, for she slept badly, she could not dispel a virginity preserved through childbirth which clung to her like a sheet. Now, she had given birth to a child, so obviously she wasn't a virgin, but her engagement in the sexual act had nothing to do with real passion, orgasm. So it's like she was always a virgin, although she was already a mother. And this idea of this, room of her own, it comes from that emptiness that is left in her. Why? Because she cannot feel that passion for her husband. So she is like an untouched virgin. She could see what she lacked. It was not beauty. It was not mind. So it's not like she wasn't beautiful. It's not like she wasn't intelligent. It was something central which permeated, something warm, as she was living in a vault, see? Something warm which broke up surfaces and rippled the cold contact of man and woman or of women together. Now, this is something really extraordinary coming from Virginia Woolf so long back. She's saying that the cold contact of man and woman, the cold contact of woman and woman, that can be broken only by the warmth of intimacy. And that is what she lacked. Okay? Yet she could not resist sometimes yielding to the charm of a woman. So the homosexual leanings that might be there somewhere in her are veiled under the heterosexual marriage. And then she calls it a folly. She did undoubtedly then feel what man felt, only for a moment, but it was enough. It was a sudden revelation, a tinge like a blush which one tried to check, and then look at the words blush, okay, tinge, as if she is not very comfortable in admitting it openly. And she considers the homosexual feelings in her or leanings in her as something which is forbidden, something which is unnatural. But this question of love, she thought, putting her coat away, this falling in love with women, and then she thinks about one specific woman in her life, Sally Seton. Take Sally Seton. Her relation in the old days with Sally Seton had not that after all been love. So she is questioning herself that her feelings for Sally Seton, she believes, was nothing less than love. And she then gives us these glimpses into her interaction with Sally. But all that evening, so she's already taken us back to her past. So we have to rush back to the past to now look at Clarissa and Sally together, how they were together. Who was this Sally? All that evening, she could not take her eyes off Sally. It was an extraordinary beauty of the kind she most admired. So Sally was dark, large eyed, with that quality which, since she hadn't got it herself, she always envied. So it's natural, like we usually feel great looking at somebody who has every feature which we do not have. So it happens with people. So Sally was opposite of Clarissa when it came to her physical features. Sally it was who made her feel for the first time how sheltered the life at Bhutan was. She knew nothing about sex, nothing about social problems. She had once seen an old man who had dropped dead in a field. She had seen cows just after their calves were born. That means Clarissa was not aware of sexual intimacy. She wasn't aware of serious things of life like death. She was in a shielded environment. And Aunt Helena never liked discussion of anything. So Sally gave Clarissa that entry into a whole new world. There they sat hour after hour, talking in her bedroom at the top of the house, talking about life, how they were to reform the world. They meant to found a society to abolish private property and actually had a letter written, though not sent out. The ideas were Sally's, of course, but very soon she was just as excited, read Plato in bed before breakfast, read Morris, read Shelley by the hour. So the gradual development of this desire in her, it was not just about physical companionship or passion, but about an intimacy that is rooted in intellectual and emotional companionship. Sally's power was amazing, her gift, her personality. Okay, so now we are transported to that world, and then she goes on describing Sally and how exciting her companionship was. And she says, then she forgot her sponge and ran along the passage naked. So just imagine the kind of carefree spirit that Sally was. The strange thing on looking back was the purity, the integrity of her feeling for Sally. It was not like one's feeling for a man. And then she distinguishes between the love that a woman can have for a woman and the love that a woman can have for a man. And she says that it's a very special kind of bond which no woman can have with a man. And they always thought that their marriages are going to pull them apart. Obviously, they cannot have a relationship after that. No, the words meant absolutely nothing to her now. She could not even get an echo of her old emotion. But she could remember going cold with excitement and doing her hair in a kind of ecstasy. So she remembers how she felt then, but she didn't feel it now. And then she is taking us to an incident where she was coming down, down the flight of stairs to dinner in a white frock to meet Sally Seton. So the erotic element of this relationship, the expectation, the anticipation, everything is so beautifully drawn. And then they had planned to actually go out in that evening. It was actually Sally's plan. So let's just read that part. Suddenly she said, "What a shame to sit indoors." And they all went out onto the terrace and walked up and down. Peter Walsh and Joseph Britkoff went on about Wagner. So the men were speaking on Wagner. She and Sally fell a little behind. So a moment is being created in front of us. Peter and Joseph, they were walking ahead. These two girls, they were behind. Then came the most exquisite moment of her whole life, passing a stone urn with flowers in it. Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lip. The whole world might have turned upside down. The others disappeared. There she was alone with Sally, and she felt that she had been given a present. It's like a whole life is presented to her, a moment is presented to her, wrapped up and told just to keep it, not to look at it. A diamond, something infinitely precious, wrapped up, private. And we know how privacy means in this novel, which as they walked up and down, she uncovered, or the radiance burned through, the revelation, the religious feeling. And this is where Virginia Woolf becomes James Joyce, the fervor of emotion, passion. So very similar lines you find in A Portrait of the Artist too. The idea of revelation, love as revelation. So Sally provided Clarissa with a wholesome experience, not just a physical or intellectual intimacy, but like associating the kiss with a religious feeling is a blasphemous thing. It's something which religious people would hate her to write, but it shows the intensity of her love for Sally. Stargazing, said Peter. So when Peter looked at them, like they had this kiss, and then after that, they faced Peter and Joseph. Peter says, "Stargazing?" Peter never could guess that they were kissing. He thought they were just falling behind looking at the stars. Maybe that's what women do anyway. It was like running one's face against a granite wall in the darkness. So after that moment of arousal, Peter's words were like stone. It was shocking, it was horrible. And then there was this growing jealousy. She felt his hostility, his jealousy, because Peter was probably also having some sense here, some kind of intuitive idea. And there's this very fine battle of possession between Peter and Sally regarding Clarissa. His determination to break into their companionship. All this she saw as one sees a landscape in a flash of lightning. And it's like Sally had already won her. Peter cannot even hope to do that. Oh, this horror, she said to herself, as if she had known all along that something would interrupt, would embitter her moment of happiness. Yet, after all, how much she owed to him later. Then we come back to the present tense or the present time. And now Clarissa is thinking about Peter and his contribution to her life. Because she wanted his good opinion so much, perhaps she owed him words. Like he taught her certain words or meaning of certain words like sentimental, civilized. They started up every day of her life as if he guarded her. A book was sentimental. Her attitude to life sentimental. Sentimental. Perhaps she was to be thinking of the past. What would he think, she wondered, when he came back, that she had grown older? Now if Peter comes back, how will Peter look at her? That she has grown older? Would he say that? Or would she see him thinking when he came back that she had grown older? Maybe he will not say anything out of civility. But if she sees him looking at her, she would know that he's thinking, I am grown old. It was true. Since her illness, she had turned almost white. And we are constantly given this reminder that she was ill at one point, just a few days back. She was not old yet. She had just broken into her 52nd year. Months and months of it were still untouched. June, July, August. There was so much to live. Each still remained almost whole. And then she looked at herself. And then she thinks, how many million times she had seen her face, and always with the same imperceptible contraction. She always, contracts her face like this. And whenever she looks at her own image, she looks with like a scrutinizing look, and she's doing the same thing again. She pursed her lips like this. When she looked at the glass, it was to give her a face point. Face point is like when you put your lips together and do like this to make your face look more pointed, and more pointed means more beautiful and sharp. And especially when you are growing older, your skin tends to sag a little. Then you have to actually raise your eyebrows and point your lips upwards to make it look less old. Okay, so she's doing like that. That was herself when some effort, some call on her to be herself, drew the parts together. She alone knew how different, how incompatible and composed so far the world only into one center, one diamond, one woman who sat in her drawing room and made a meeting point. So it's like when she's looking at herself, she sees that there is a structure there, a definite person there, fixed person there. But without Sally, this definiteness about her wouldn't have formed. Now, where was her dress? So suddenly she is again thinking about the dress she's going to wear for the party. And then she realized that this dress had some kind of tear. She decides to mend it. And this whole idea of torn dress and mending it, we find it in A Doll's House too. It's like the tendency in women to make compromise, to mend the marriage instead of discarding it, to try, give it a second time, third time, or fourth time to work. So her life with Richard is like this green dress that she's looking at, artificial, which looks good under artificial lights, but it has no connection to natural passion. And then this dress of hers, where was the tear? And now a needle to be threaded. This was a favorite dress, one of Sally Parker's, the last almost she ever made. And now this is a different Sally. Okay. And then suddenly the words come to her again. Fear no more, says the heart. Fear no more, says the heart. And then the front bell rings. Who can? What can? Now, she thinks that it's 11 o'clock in the morning and the party is in the evening. Why should anybody come now? She heard a hand upon the door. So she is sitting in a room. Somebody has already come. She made to hide her dress like a virgin protecting chastity, respecting privacy. Now the brass knob slipped. Now the door opened. And in came. Who came? For a single second, she could not remember what he was called. So surprised she was to see him. So glad, so shy, so utterly taken aback. Who was it? It was Peter Walsh. And he had actually sent her a letter, but she hadn't read it. So Peter Walsh come to her unexpectedly in the morning. And how are you? Said Peter, positively trembling. So it's like they haven't lost touch with each other or lost contact with each other. They had a breakup when they were young. After that, Peter went his own way, she went her own way. And now we have Peter coming to her house, asking her how she is. There is no bitterness here, right? And this conversation with Peter will take us to the next part of our reading. And I want you to watch that video, which will come soon after this one, so that I can take you to the point where Mrs. Dalloway will eventually have a heart-to-heart talk with Peter about her past, about her present, and see how this becomes important in context of her evening party and how the whole thing is also connected to the life and struggles of Septimus Smith. So stay subscribed. I'll see you all very soon in my next video. Till then, stay happy, stay safe. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Bye-bye.